We are so lucky to have Yahdon Israel here. We want to not waste a minute of his precious time. Before I give the formal introduction, I just want to say it has been so wonderful to work with Yahdon. He's taught in our MFA program at City College for, I think, a couple of years. I won't be
specific. About 2 or 3.
About 2 or 3 years. And every time when we were in person, when before he would teach or after he'd sort of walk by the MFA office, we'd have a conversation. My mind would be blown. No matter what you're coming for, you're going to learn something incredible. So thank you, Yahdon, for coming. I'm going to briefly introduce him. He is an educator, longtime educator, entrepreneur, editor, writer, and he's founder of Literaryswag, a cultural movement that intersects literature and fashion to make books cool. He teaches creative writing in our MFA program. He's also the former editor-in-chief of Brooklyn Magazine, has written for the New Inquiry, LitHub, and Vanity Fair, and currently he's a senior editor at Simon and Schuster. And if you want to know everything about editing, the process, you should definitely get on his Twitter feed. Yahdon, thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you all for having me. It would help. I don't know if people have their cameras off for personal reasons, but if you can turn your camera on, I would greatly appreciate it, only because it really helps to see people's faces, because it helps just inform the way I talk and stuff like that. And it just helps me see if the information is resonating. So if you can't, I understand, but if you can, please do. So my name is Yahdon Israel. I recently got hired as an senior editor at Simon and Schuster back in March. So this is my 7th month in this position. 7 months, no, actually 8 months tomorrow it makes. And in that time, I've acquired 7 books so far, 6 works of nonfiction, 1 work of fiction. I've acquired a book for as much as $465,000, and I've acquired a book for as low as $35,000, which means in terms of the spectrum of books and values that I'm able to assess and assign to work, I can talk about these. I can talk about this framework of the value of a book proposal from the most boutique niche audience to the more mainstream target Walmart audience, right? So one of the main things, and to give some context to this conversation, it was important to me when anytime I talk to Michelle, what I'm always thinking about, both, one, being a student of an MFA program who graduated not only with a degree, but with an insurmountable amount of debt. The immediate thing I thought about was like, how am I paying this shit back? Where is the money coming from to pay this back, right? So I'm always thinking in numbers, because I was raised in an entrepreneurial house where it's like nothing was for free. So if you had debt, you had to figure out how to pay it back. And I know that's because some of these numbers that we owe the Department of Education or private loans is so, like, the commas and the amount of digits can be so unreal. It can feel like abstract, but those numbers are really concrete to me. And they should be concrete to anyone who's looking to have a career in this industry. So this is what I want to start this with, in terms of context, was I wanted to offer not only a class that would begin to get writers looking to develop their craft on the page, a framework, how to think about how to navigate in the industry, because everything you need to understand, and I really think that, like, the way an MBA is in theory supposed to prepare that finance student for the professional world of business and finance, I think that the MFA should, in addition to, help writers develop their craft, I think that in addition, it should prepare writers for the business and the industry of publishing, which is very different than the love of literature. Like, I think anybody who's here knows that there are so many workshops and, like, different types of opportunities to develop your craft. Developing your craft is something that you're going to commit the rest of your career to. But learning the business is something that I think, especially in the 2 years you have between developing your manuscript and getting an agent, representation, all those things, beginning to have a framework of understanding the business is one of the more crucial elements of, like, when you graduate with an MFA, you should be able to say you know how to do certain things as a professional writer, right? So the first thing I want y'all to do, there's this book I want everybody to get. It's called The Merchants. I don't think it's called The Merchants of Culture. I'm typing it in the chat. The book is by, I'll tell you in a minute. But this is a must-have book. John Thompson, I'll type that in the chat too. And what this book is a comprehensive study and analysis of the publishing industry from its early aughts when it first arrived in the late 1900s to probably about the late to 2010s. And so many of the ways in which this industry works, this book is really a macro assessment about how this industry came to be. What are some of the working assumptions that inform not only value, but business practices, which then enables you as writers to see where you fit into a larger industrial framework. One of the things that happens when you come into the world of books is many of us came here, many of us are introduced to the world of books through the lens of readers. We read the book, we read books, we know we love to read, we want to write books. And so we are assessing the industry through the lens of aesthetics, through the lens of craft, through the lens of literary, meritocracy. And so how can you say this? We're constructing our beliefs of value, what books should be worth X, what books should sell X amount of things based on our literary and artistic taste, which have nothing to do with market values. And so what this particular lecture is about is how do you as a writer reconcile market values with the literary aesthetics that you practice in your art. And it's not about you, not to discourage the valuation of your art. It's not to tell you to do something else, but it's about you having an honest, like a truth and reconciliation about what you're doing and what it costs. And understanding the trajectory of what it means to have a literary career, which is very different than what it means to have a singular book deal. So I'm gonna start this conversation this way. I want to ask you, and this is why cameras will help, but if you don't, I would just like you to, raise your hand with the raise your hand function. How many of you buy books from an independent bookstore? Raise your hand if you buy books from an independent bookstore. Okay. All right. We got some hands. We got some hands. Okay. How many of you buy books from Barnes and Nobles? Raise your hand if you buy books from Barnes and Nobles. All right. All right. Well, Sarah, this is a very particular conversation, right? So library, I'm coming to that one. How many of you buy books from Amazon? All right, a lot of people. Okay, more people than. How many of you buy your books from Target and Walmart? Okay, 2 hands. And how many of you get your books from the library? Okay, now, one of the things you should have noticed, and I'm never surprised by this poll, is this is how I use to dramatize the valuation of books, is writers have a very different relationship with the market value of books. Why do I say that? Is because as a writer who buys a book, your relationship with that book is not that of a consumer, but it's that of investor. Meaning you are, anytime you buy a book, investing in your craft, which is very different than the person who buys a book for pleasure. So the role is different. So when I asked you all where you buy your books, Amazon, I'm pretty sure for the price points because it helps you save money. the Barnes and Nobles and the independent bookstores and the libraries, because this is a different, you have a craft, you have an investment-based relationship with books, which is very different than the Target and Walmart audience who have a consumptive relationship with books. Now, what makes a Simon & Schuster different than a Graywolf, for example? What makes a big publisher different than a university press is about where are we able as a publisher to distribute books to, right? When you're talking about books that sells in the hundreds of thousands and the millions, those books have to be in the places where most people are. Meaning, when you think about the fact that although independent bookstores is where many writers find their books, you're also talking about a particular type of person who has a built-in understanding of their own valuation of what a book is. So when a person goes into an independent bookstore, they at the very least have some literary taste on some level. So we're already talking about a more refined palette than somebody who's walking into Walmart or Target and they're trying to buy some Pampers and some Mop and Glow, and maybe they bought, you know, some ices, and then they happen to see a bestseller in the book section. But this is what lies at the heart of the valuation of books, and it also is what informs why the book proposal matters. Because what the book proposal is for you as a writer is a way for you to conceive of where do you see your books actually being out in the world. Not who you want to read them, but what become the avenues and channels by which that person even discovers that book. So when you look in an independent bookstore, you have to think about all the states and cities who don't have them, right? When you think about the Barnes and Nobles and like the major retailers, you have to think about all of those types of stores who closed down. When you look at an Amazon, you have to think about the algorithms that run how books are suggested and which books get get pushed up on the algorithms. And then you think about the widest array of books, where books are sold, where people buy books from the most is where writers buy books from the least. Like you have to look at that, where most of everyone else is going to buy books. That's where us as people in this industry who are practitioners of this industry go the least. So what it already communicates is that there is a sort of ships at night relationship between writers who are writing books for a larger public and the public that actually buys books. Now, I want you to do an exercise. All these things are premises and prerequisites in order to understand the value of the book proposal. I need you to take out some paper, paper and pen. Does everybody grab a piece of paper and a pen? Everybody got their pen and paper, please. Everybody good? We good? Pen and paper? I want you to draw up 3 circles, like a Venn diagram, if you will. So it should look like this. 3 circles, like a overlapping Venn diagram. In one circle, I want you to write your name. It could be any circle. And another circle, I want you to write money. And in the 3rd circle, I want you to write books. Now, what I want you to do is look at the areas of intersection. People who have money and might like you might buy something from you. People who like books and like you might get your books. People who have money and like books might buy books, but they might not buy yours. That area in the middle is the smallest area where all 3 things intersect. So for example, a person who likes you and doesn't spend money on books is somebody who would go to the library to get your book, somebody who would get an advanced reader copy, somebody who might be a friend, somebody who might get a galley or something else of that sort, or you might give the book to them for free. Somebody who might have money and like you might buy something of yours, but they ain't gonna buy a book because they don't read books. They might, tell me when you got some t-shirts, tell me when you got some sort of merchandise, some trinkets. I'll buy a mug from you. I'm not going to buy a book. And then there's people who buy books who, because they've never heard of you, won't buy yours, right? So when we talk about the valuation of a writer, as an editor, an acquisitions editor at a major publishing house, what I am looking at when we talk about values are how all three of these circles intersect at the point of valuation of said writer's work. So we're looking at an already built-in audience of who has the money to buy the kind of books that we produce, which is, if you have a hardcover book, your hardcover book can go for as low as $22 and as much as $30. Who has $22 to $30? How many people are going to spend $30 on a book by a debut author they've never heard of? That informs the framework of valuation for many things. So another question for you, one of the most lauded writers in American letters, one of the most, right? Toni Morrison. I want you to take a guess, write it in the chat. How many books do you think how many books do you think The Bluest Eye sold? First book came out in 1970. Just type a number. It's a little game of.
As of this date or in the debut?
No, when it came out in 1970. 50K. 60K. 10K. All right. Y'all are wishful thinkers. I love it. She sold, when that book first came out, Stuart's pretty much closer, 2,500 copies of The Bluest Eye when it first came out. She was still an editor at Random House when she wrote that book. How many people know what her first bestseller was? For the sake of time, I'll answer it. Beloved. Now, Beloved came out in 1987. Now think about the trajectory I'm laying out here. Her first book came out in 1970 and sold 2,500 copies. She doesn't get her bestseller to 17 years later after writing 4 books in between. Anybody want to offer why they think it took 17 years for Toni Morrison to become a bestseller? This is a room full of writers. I would hope some, can we get? So Michelle, you identified it, had to develop an audience. When Toni Morrison moved into the world, right? So we talk about these intersections, right? So if you do another circle, right? If you highlight the circle of books and money, right? The people who have books, who buy books and have money is already a smaller circle than either of those singled, right? Then we're talking about Toni Morrison sliding up into that diagram. When she moved into that diagram, her first book was to a largely unsuspecting audience. So her first book reflected what the market understood of her work at that time. So her first book was bound to sell 2,500 copies. It's literary fiction. It's about, you know, the quote that so many writers love to quote. If you have a book that you haven't read yet, write it. Now that's a beautiful thing to say in a craft class, in a workshop, but that has marketing implications. If you wrote something no one ever read, that means no one ever marketed it before, no one's ever publicized it, no one's ever sold it. So we don't even know how to sell this thing, right? It's like trying to sell the telephone before the technology existed to have one. It's like, so you're telling me if I get 2 of these, I can put this in your house and this in my house and we can talk to each other? How many people you think is going for that from the beginning? It's always easy in retrospect to look at a Toni Morrison and go, oh, her books were always selling. No, you have to think about the trajectory that made Toni Morrison versus where we understand Toni Morrison to be now and reverse engineer it. Is like understanding the history of a trajectory is about understanding value. So her first book sold 2,500 copies. And the reason why is because she was moving into a different market. She was moving into a market where the people who spent money on books did not know, outside of her being a Black woman and the story she was telling, it was just a new writer. The New York Times this year just published a story in April that said that last year, when publishing had its best year to date in terms of print books, the two areas that did the best were backlist books, which I'll get into in a minute, and books by celebrities. Now, a backlist title is a book that, so let's say, for example, your book came out today, October 22nd, 2021. As a publisher, when we are building out the advance, our advance is based on what we believe that book has the capacity to sell within a year's time. So we create something called a profit and loss statement. It's how we value a book, a commercial viability within a year's time. Now, a backlist title is any book that sells outside of that first year from publication. So let's say we get to October 23rd, 2022, that book effectively becomes a backlist title from that point. So let's say, for example, you sell 10,000 copies, but you sell 10,000 copies on the 23rd. By the design of the P&L, that book was not profitable. Even though that book would go on to sell later on the backlist, the front list is how we assess the value. Now, here's where things get wonky. 98% of the books by debut authors that came out last year sold less than 5,000 copies. 98% in the year where books did their best, 98% of the books that came out by debut authors sold less than 5,000 copies. So what you should be seeing in the pattern is Toni Morrison publishing The Bluest Side in the 1970s is not indicative of anything besides the fact that if you look at the trend of why do debut authors have a 98% chance of selling less than 5,000 copies, it's because you are having a new artist entered a marketplace where there is already a premium, a high volume of work. So most of the books that sold well were books that came out 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago. What does this communicate? It communicates that while the industry, the market, the economic framework that publishing acquires books is not actually aligned with the time it takes for a book to find its real audience. That's what that's what we're constantly reconciling as a publisher. So books take time to read, right? It's different than an album, whereas like if an album has a 1 hour running time, it might take you a year to listen to that album, but it doesn't take a year to listen to the album. It takes you an hour, right? If a movie is 2 hours long, that's how long it takes. But with a book does not have a running time on it. So a book can take you 5 years to read. It can take you 2 years to talk about it with your friend, which can take them 3 years to get it, so the time it takes for the word of mouth and all the things that other forms of media have that allows that speed to occur, publishing moves at a slower speed. What does this mean in terms of the valuation of a book? As an acquisitions editor, I not only have to think about the valuation now, I have to think about the trajectory of the writer in question. The way in which the publishing industry will have writers think you have to come is to acquire one book at a time. Now, here's something that is a bit of a conundrum in publishing is at a place like a major publisher, we have to function under the belief that if we acquire a book, it has to sell 20,000 copies within its first year. Now, I have to believe that that book is capable of selling that against data that already showed that 98% of the books that come out by debut authors will sell less than 5,000 copies, which means that every publisher at a major publishing house is operating under the guise that they are going to find that book that operates in the 2% that sells more than 5,000 copies, right? Now think about when you have one editor think that way, and then you multiply that by 6 and 7 editors who think that way at an imprint, and times that 6 by 7 by 16 imprints in a publishing house, and then times that many people by the amount of publishing houses that exist. You have a grand swell of people fighting to be in that 2% when a majority of them land in the 98%. And this 98% happens irrespective of the advance. So many writers, one of the myths that writers believe is, oh, if a book got more of an advance, that means that book got more of a marketing budget, which it does. Typically, your marketing budget is 10% of your advance. So if you get $100,000 book advance, $10,000 marketing budget. So the theory is, oh, well, that book did better simply because they got paid. They got paid more. Here to tell you, not true. If that was the case, publishers would just buy books for millions of dollars. But what even happens with publishers is they put millions of dollars in the projects that sell less than 5,000 copies, and they spend $50,000 for a project that sells hundreds of thousands of copies. So even in this industry, nobody really knows what sells and what doesn't. Everybody is doing the work of guessing. So all the valuations comes down to an intersection of a particular editor's understanding of markets and their own artistic and aesthetic tastes. I'm gonna say that again. Every editor's valuation comes down to an intersection of their own aesthetic taste and values mixed with their understanding of the market. So what does that mean? That means that there are editors who have great literary taste, and because they love a book, they will pay too much for a book. And what does paying too much for a book means? It means that a writer who probably was had the capacity to sell 5,000 copies now has the type of advance where they're now expected to sell 50,000 copies. And this is their first book. Now, what's the long-term implications of that? How many of you are familiar with the conversation that happened last year, what publishing paid me? And you have people like Jesmyn Ward and Kiese Lehman and different writers revealing what they got paid. Now, from the outside looking in, which I was just not a year ago, I was like, oh, this is fucked up. I'm gonna just be really frank. Like, oh, why is this person getting paid this? And that book won a National Book Award. And this book, being on the other side of it, I realized that while that conversation was necessary, it was incomplete. Here's why. People who got bigger advances for their first book, and this is usually when your agent is trying to get the most money for you because you don't have a sales track record. So right now, your book is capable of doing anything in theory because there's no sales record. Once you have a sales record in this industry, that becomes in some ways like your scarlet letter if you don't earn out. And but it becomes you become a number. It becomes, this is what you sold. So the reason why I say that that conversation was incomplete was because what you did not see was the trajectory of writers who started off with lower advances and what they got on a second book, what they got on a third book, what they got on a fourth book, versus writers who got large advances on a first book. Did they ever get a second book? Right? What if they did get a second book? Was that advance equal to the amount of the first book? That is the conversation that was missing from the larger framework of what publishing paid me, is because when you're looking at what people get paid on their first book, what it cultivates in every writer's mind is that the first book is the make and break of your writer's career. And what I'm here to tell you is that your trajectory long-term is what makes your career. Toni Morrison did not get a Nobel because she just wrote The Bluest Eye. She had a body of work, 7 books out before she was even, I think it was 6 books before she even was before she was a bestseller. At that time that she won the Nobel, she had about 7 books out already. So to make this industry and focus it all on one book, it's almost like we're regarding the literary industry the way we would regard a college basketball player career at a university. Right? We're looking at the finite amount of time that a person has to execute certain thing before they burn out. Whereas, you know, in this industry, you could be 40 years old, 50 years old, 60 years old, and be a debut author. All of that means that the industry operates very differently. And so the reason why I'm taking this, like, in a way, what seems tangential, it is the best route to help you understand why the book proposal matters. Because what the book proposal helps you assess is the value of what you're able to produce at your stage at that point in your literary career. And so what happens with the book proposal, and this is so, how many people here write fiction? Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay. How many people here write nonfiction? Okay. So, how many people here write poetry? Okay. For the people in fiction, which genre of fiction do you think, which form, not genre, which form do you think sells the best between short story, novella, and novels? You can type it in the chat. Novels. Okay, for the nonfiction people, which form do you think sells the best between narrative nonfiction, memoir, autobiography, and essay collections? Okay. For the people, for anybody who wants to answer, why do you think, if you are a fiction writer, why do you think novels sell better than novellas and short stories? Anyone can unmute themselves. This is, no, that's not it, Brendan. Good try. Appreciate you.
If you're buying a book, you feel like you get a better bang for your buck if it's a novel.
Why? You're getting it. You're tapping.
Cost of publication and printing is pretty much the same, and you get a longer story. So
here's why. You get into it. When you read a novel, right? You get a book, and you spend $30 on a novel, right? When you get to the end of a novel, you want to feel like you completed something. I finished the novel, right? When I'm on page 270, I feel like I'm on page 270. I feel like I'm progressing. I can literally, right? It's psychological, right? You seeing that little bookmark or that little pin and seeing at first the bottom half of the book was thick as shit. And then you're like, oh, the top half, I'm almost done. When you read a short story collection, when you get to page 270, you might be deeper into the book, but you might not have progressed in the story, because if you read a short story collection and the story ends on page 25, on page 26, you've got to start over again, right? And it's the same logic for essays. When you read to page 75, you completed an essay, but you didn't complete the book. So it's almost like, oh, damn, like I got to go back in. It's a different kind of experience. So now I come back to the question of the types of books that sell well at the independent level, the memoirs, I mean, not the memoirs, the essays, the poetries, and the short story collections. The novels sell best at the larger levels. The reason why is because the experiences are different. When a writer buys essays and short stories, they're usually studying form. They're reading it as a student or a practitioner of the craft, right? So almost think of essays, poetry, and short stories as like your mixtape, like playing at the Blue Note, right? The novel, the memoir, the narrative nonfiction is playing at the Garden. It just has a wider appeal. It's not because people are less intelligent. It's all about the way in which people engage with the same product. Now, anybody who's went to a concert with a friend who either studies music theory or sings know it can possibly be a very exhausting experience, because you just there to enjoy the music and they singing the song flat. And it's like, I don't, just enjoy it, right? But when you understand something, you engage with it in an inherently different way. And so it's important for you as writers to understand that what an MFA and what years of writing and talking to writers can create is a false sense of who your audience is. So what you end up believing is that you're writing a book for the people at your workshop table. And that's fine if that's who you know your audience is. Because if you know that's who your audience is, then that means you have to accept what an advance for writing for an audience like that will look like. Versus if you know you're writing for the kind of person that's going to find a book in Target, you can then assess what that kind of book looks like. And so one of the things that's difficult about navigating the MFA space and then getting an agent and then getting an editor is that you're so removed from your audience that you don't even know who they are anymore. You think you're writing for the person in front of you. So at one point, it's people write to impress their workshop group or their workshop instructor. Then it's you're writing to get the agent to okay, you're writing to get your agent to represent you. Then you're writing for the editor to acquire you. But the last thing you're thinking about is the first person that should be the crucial element to your proposal. Who is going to buy this book and how are they going to find it? What that thinking of the book proposal does, the main function of the book proposal is not just to get you to think about the book you're writing, but is to get you to reverse engineer how the person you would want to discover that book finds that book. And based on who you want to discover that book and where they would find it, that informs the type of book you're doing. Does that make sense? So basically what you're doing is instead of writing a piece of work that you're trusting a publisher to find an audience for, because publishing does not work that way. We do not create audiences. We sell to an audience that already exists. Henceforth, why 98% of debut authors sell less than 5,000 copies, because we're plugging sales streams that we already know we can sell to, because it's a business. Because publishing as a business model does not sell direct to consumer. Some you can buy from your, like how many of you go to Simon & Schuster or Random House to buy your books? Exactly. You see? So we don't make the money by selling direct to book readers. We sell to booksellers who sell to readers. Amazon buys books from us. Target buys books from us. Independent bookstores buy books from us. So the booksellers actually are the ones interfacing with people's taste and why they're buying books. All we are getting back for the most part are the numbers. A publisher doesn't know who's buying what. And like we could get demographics, but demographics, for example, are not psychographics, meaning why are people buying books? What motivates them? How many books are they buying? What motivated this? Why is this book doing so much better later than it did in the first year? By the time James Baldwin, for example, was dead, most of his books were out of print. The man was not a he was a well-known speaker at that time, but people were not running to the bookstore to buy his books. It was his celebrity and his speaking engagements that kept him financially afloat. It wasn't until after he died that because you could no longer request James Baldwin to come talk at your school, then it's like, I guess we got to buy the books now because that's what's left of him. Right? So I say that to say, when you look at the sort of writers whose trajectories you love, what typically writers do is they look at the artistic trajectory. what I'm telling you to do is to do investigation about, as well as the artistic trajectory, is the economic trajectory. Because the economic trajectory tells a very different story than the ones we're used to telling, internalizing about this industry, which is like, I'm just going to be the best writer and everything will work out. That only works if that thought process is aligned with sound economics, meaning you're taking the type of advances that assess where you are for the particular book you're doing, right? So if you're doing a book, and I know people are gonna, I'm gonna leave the last, we could go a little bit over if it's all right with you, Michelle, because I want to answer questions. But what I'm gonna send and what I'm gonna, if you give me, hold on. Stuart, if you want to give me camera share, not camera share, but screen share capacity, I'm going to show like an outline for a book proposal. So when you write fiction, what you get, what a fiction writer sends is the complete manuscript along with an overview of the project. When you are a nonfiction writer, because typically a fiction writer can complete the project because it's a work of fiction. But when you're doing nonfiction, like a research, like you're doing a narrative nonfiction and your book requires money to even complete it, you're doing something that's akin to, this is the way to think about the book proposal. Your book proposal is equivalent to a business plan. It's a prospectus, right? And so, in other words, your advance is not profit, it's more like a business loan. It's more like an investment. That's why the full term of the advance is an advance against royalties. But until you get royalties, that is not profit. That is a business loan or an investment, not a business loan, but an investment. So it's almost like the way people talk about advances is almost as though like you got a big check to just do whatever you want with it. And it's like, no, it's almost like if you were making a restaurant and a bank gave you $100,000, that $100,000 has to go into the completion of the restaurant. And that first 100,000 in theory is not profit. That first 100,000 is just a payback to break even, and everything after is your profit. So Toni Morrison didn't quit her job as an editor until her royalties started paying for her. She didn't quit when she was getting advances. She quit when the royalties started matching what advances were. And so her ability to have a long career was hedged on 20 years working in the industry as a publisher. She worked in publishing for 20 years. So she knew, oh, this is a slow burn. So I only need the amount of money that's going to enable me to write this book as best as I can write it. So even if you look at the dates at which some books came out 2-3 years between, some books came out 4 or 5 years, but it didn't matter because she wasn't using her literary career to feed her. It was, I'm using the money from my literary career to fuel my literary career. But my livelihood is going to come from my professing, it's going to come from my editing. And it's not until I get these royalties that I'm going to become a full-time writer. Right? Which is different than a Stephen King, whose trajectory, if anybody's read On Writing by Stephen King, he spells out the same thing. I remember his first advance like $250. It was like something laughable, right? But what happens with a Stephen King, a Danielle Steele, a James Patterson, what they deliver is a book a year reliably. So it becomes clockwork with them. Every year, you're getting a book. So what we're building into as a publisher is we know that every year this person delivers a book, they already have an audience waiting for what's the next book. So every year, the reason why a Stephen King or any of those, James Pattersons of the world can get $1 million every new book is because they're delivering a new book reliably every year for an audience, and they're building on that audience every year. So you multiply that by 10 years and you just build on the same thing. you have somebody who is, which is very rare in the literary world, which is like a sort of celebrity, right? The Malcolm Gladwells, right? The very few people who cross over into the larger public consciousness that people know to be writers, right? Versus where for us, the world that we live in, the literaries, the people like, the Colson Whiteheads, like they do not show up on the radar of the larger cultural, consciousness, right? In order to show up on a larger cultural consciousness, you got to sell into the millions of copies of books, right? And that's rare for 98% of the industry. So we're talking about a 2% amount of books published by every year. The US alone publishes 1 million books. So 1 million books come out a year. So even if you look at even 2% of that is still 200,000 books operate in the minority of the fact that people know them, right? You got to think about how much volume is coming out. Meaning, when you look, did you give me the file sharing, the screen share? So now I'm gonna bring up the book proposal for you, the book proposal outline. Okay, boom, share screen. So what the logic of the book proposal outline is about, right? And this is something that I wish somebody explained to me in the way I'm explaining it to you, because when I was writing, I could not for the life of me understand not what the questions were, but like, why do I need to know this? Like, I'm gonna just write the book. Like the publisher will figure this stuff out. Like, that is not the publisher's job. The publisher is almost like a conveyor belt in many ways. We know what the channels are. What we need to know is, does this book align with the channels of access we have? So really, the person we're trusting to know the book better than anybody is the writer. So if you are a writer who is expecting the publisher to tell you what your book is, or the agent to tell you what your book is, you have to recalibrate your notion of what it means to be a writer in this industry. Your agent, your editor, everybody is taking cues from the vision you have about your book. And the vision of the book has to be in line with the person you intend to buy the book. So you see here, like what the book is about, why the topic is important. Those are the sort of questions that come at the level of the publicity team who has to talk about this book to the various outlets to get you coverage. When we're talking about the audience, this is something that I have to change in here, which is like, who will read this book? I think a better question is who will buy this book? Because when you think about what becomes worth somebody's potential last $30, it changes how you think about the stakes of what you're doing. If someone has to spend, even if you get a paperback original deal, the last $18, you got to think about the fact that you are putting a product into the world that, I'm going to email this to Michelle, so she's going to forward this to you all. The question of who will buy this book, what it immediately does is it changes the conversation of how you're thinking about this book as a commodity. The biography of who are you, what have you done, what were you educated and trained, all of these different things, it's not to make you feel bad, it's to get you to begin to leverage every relationship you have to show where this book exists in the world. Who do you know, right? What so many people, writers, expect is that, oh, I'm going to sign to a major publisher, and a major publisher is going to put me in contact with all these people. That is not how it works. Because again, a publisher is already geared to sell books to a market that already buys books. So what we are actually looking at the writer to know is, we're acquiring a type of books where a writer can direct us to a new sales channel that we already don't have access to. So there's two ways we think about value and acquisitions. Is this book someone we know we can sell already to, hence celebrity titles, a big name author who has an audience? Or is this somebody who's going to help us find a new audience we have yet to reach, right? And those, there is no, like the way there's, the way in class they say there is no middle class in America. There is no middle class in this valuation. You're either a book that's going to help to define a new audience, or you already have an audience. Now, what tends to happen, and which is what we call a midlist title, is a title that if we spent an amount of money that would necessitate amount of books to be sold and it sells less than that book. So let's say, for example, we buy a book for $1 million. $1 million for a book means that that book has to at least sell 100,000 copies. That book sells 50,000 copies, right? That book can be on the bestsellers list for like a bunch of weeks straight. And so to the public, it looks like a success. But behind the scenes, that book was supposed to sell way more copies. That's a mid-list title. Now, that same book purchased at an advance that would warrant it only sells 10,000 copies is a success, right? So you should see how in the dynamic, the thing works where there is no sort of hard line about what's a good book deal, what's a bad book deal, what's too much, what's too little. It's about understanding these larger notions of I'm a new author in this field. This is my first project. What do I understand both of the market that exists outside of my art and how does this artistic product of mine fit into this industry? And how do I advocate for the sort of advance that sets me up for a long-term career if I plan to be here long-term, versus if I'm only looking for the one book deal in and out, then I am accepting that if this book doesn't earn out, this is it. And that's what really the book proposal is about helping a writer assess where does this book fit into the trajectory of a bibliography? Is this a one and done, right? Is this like the book that just gets you in the door? And so you're looking to just get in the door and you're looking to do something later? All those things determine not just the valuation of a publisher, but it also determines how you are able to understand your own trajectory. The reason why I say this is because I've had writers who've written books and they've advocated for all the hybrid experimental qualities of it. And I'm like, okay, based on all these things you're saying, it's like, right? Oh, this book is like this book that won this award and that award. And I'm like, yeah, and that book sold 3,000 copies. So that equivocates to, I can give you 30,000 for it. That's too low. And it's like, okay. Because it's a money conversation, right? Like theoretically, we would like to think that a National Book Award means that the book sells by this much more. But even the National Book Award only matters to a certain amount of people. It's not an Oscar. It's not a Super Bowl performance, right? You think about the difference between winning a National Book Award and then doing the inauguration. Amanda Gorman sold 250,000 copies of one single poem because she delivered a poem at the inauguration. If I'm a publisher, I'm trying to get every poet I know on my roster. Like you got to talk, you got to deliver a poem at the inauguration. Like that has to be, like that is the Super Bowl for poets. Like that's the Super Bowl, because you're talking about getting what you do out to a wider audience, right? And that's why when you look at like events like the Super Bowl, no one gets paid to do the Super Bowl. But why? It's because the opportunity to perform at the Super Bowl puts you in front of the amount of eyeballs that otherwise you would never encounter. 50 million households, 7-minute performance. So that's why so many artists launch their tours off the back of that. That's why streaming numbers shoots up into the thousands and increase, because it's about understanding, leveraging visibility against the opportunity. So if a publisher is giving you a certain advance, it's not about it being too low or too high. It's about where does this fit into my own trajectory, right? And depending on how long you understand your career to be and how long you want to be in this industry, regardless of what we offer, it's about knowing, are you setting yourself up for the long term or are you here for a short time? So coming back to that whole notion of, when we look at book proposals and we see a novelist who's doing something experimental, like there was a novel that I can tell you, brilliant on the line level, had no plot whatsoever, could not tell you what happened beginning, middle, and end, right? Now, the valuation just on voice alone, we valued it at 75 to 100,000, simply because the writer is a voice that we know that even if this book doesn't earn out, it'll get enough awards where it can level out. Meaning the advance is not so much that if this author didn't earn back the advance, that it would put them in a position where they would never be able to recoup, because at a certain level, right? Like, so the way levels work in a publishing house is it works in like increments of like $50,000 to $100,000. And so with every $50,000 to $100,000, the amount of books that person has to sell jumps exponentially, right? So at 100,000 for a literary fiction book, you don't have to sell but 20,000 copies, right? But because it's literary fiction, we understand that that takes time. Now, that same literary fiction title that would be like, let's say, for example, that same 100,000 for literary fiction, if you are writing a memoir, you have to sell more copies. Why? Because that genre sells more copies across the board. So every genre has different expectations of a built-in understanding of what the audience is capable of maintaining. Right? So what is successful for a literary writer? So if a literary writer sold 10,000 copies, as a publishing house, you're like, oh, that's what we expected. It's literary. But if a celebrity memoir sold 10,000 copies, we like, holy shit, what, like, get someone on the phone. Because we're dealing with audiences. How did this book that has this built-in audience with all this visibility sell as much as somebody who's writing beautiful sentences? Right? Those are the sort of notions and the notions that we deal with, is like, we're constantly reconciling the art and the commerce. And what I'm here to just deliver to you before I, end, is like, what I have seen in so many of my conversations with authors is that very few, if any, a minority of authors possess even the curiosity of wanting to understand how the commerce of publishing works. What most writers care about is just having a book in the world. And so what you kind of get is this very uneven relationship where, like, as an editor, you're looking for someone who is, in some principles, business-minded. Meaning you can think very honestly and candidly about where your books would show up and how they would get there, versus what most writers I've encountered personally in meetings. They're expecting, well, I thought that's the publisher's job. I thought that's the publisher's job. I thought that's the publisher's job. And it's kind of like, okay, if we're doing everything, then why would we buy your book? Like, what exactly are you doing for us? Like, why not give this same money to somebody who's going to also understand, like, oh, okay, I can take this amount of money, and then I know that this is the type of house that's going to invest in my career long-term. So I'm not asking for more money simply because I know where I fit into this house. I know where I fit into in my own trajectory. So coming back to the book in question I told you about the debut author, was a literary novel. The novel had no plot. It went to auction. We went in for $105,000. And I'm going to end, Michelle. I got you. Just want to end on this point. Last point. How much money do you think that book went for at auction? We lost. And I'm going to tell you, we bid the lowest. We bid $105,000 and we were the lowest bid. Now, mind you, this is a novel. No plot. It's all just the sentences are the most beautiful things you'll read. You will not know what's happening. Somebody want to type in the chat a number? Juliana, ding, ding, ding. That book went for $250,000. Now, let me tell you something, right? Because this value is not arbitrary, but it's contextual, right? The publishing house that bought that book is a new publishing house who wants to establish themselves as a literary presence. So $250,000 for them means that they're trying to show to the literary industry that they can compete at that level. A publishing house who's already established doesn't need to take that kind of risk. Can't tell you that. I can't tell you that, won't tell you that. I'll tell you after it comes out. But what this can end up doing for the writer, if that writer is not successful, that writer's trajectory can change drastically, because that writer is now expected to sell an amount of books that, as we said, 98% of debut authors don't sell. So the reason why you'll hear these different numbers and it can sound like, well, this person got 60 and this person got 250, understanding the larger framework of how this industry works will help you understand why certain people get paid certain numbers. So it's not about the meritocracy of this person's a better writer than you and they got paid X. It's all these other parts of the equation, that all these other variables in the equation that, because they're not constant in the mind of a writer, it just feels like it's made up. But I'm here to show you that it's all at the basis of it, math, and it's all business. So thank you. And we'll open for questions. If you have questions, yeah, we can run a little over.
Okay, great. I'm going to start with a question. And I want to thank you, Yahdon, and tell everybody you can put your questions in the chat. Stuart is monitoring the chat and we'll call on people, but you can also raise your hand and that would be fine. But I thought I would start off, Yahdon. You're bringing up a really great point, not just about what doesn't get taught in MFA programs. So I wonder if you could speak to, you and I've had conversations about how important this information is. I wonder if you could speak to the kind of writer a person becomes with this information. Like, I guess what I'm asking is, do you think knowing what you've said, the percentages, right, literary fiction, and right, one of the things about our MFA program is that we welcome all genres. But right, do you think this is going to sway the writer? I mean, is that a good thing for an editor? Is that what an editor wants to see, a writer that really knows the market?
No, it's really about a writer having a way to honestly assess what they're capable of producing in that time of their career, mm-hmm, right? Like one of the reasons why, like, if you read, and this is what I've made a habit of doing, is studying trajectories. Like, when you go back and you read like Toni Morrison, like she has, like those versions of the book that come out that are like vintage paperback versions where you get a forward from the author, mm-hmm, that looks at, and one of the things Toni Morrison said in that book was like, she realizes now that what she was asking the reader to do was too much. She was like, she distorted the timeline because she wanted the reader to put the story together themselves. And she said in there, she said, while this method touched, it did not move people like she wanted to. Now, Toni Morrison, who wrote this book, did not. That was what Toni Morrison could do at that point. The Toni Morrison who got to the place where she achieves a beloved realized, wait, I was asking my reader to do too much, which enabled her to go, okay, if I want a book that's doing something very complex, I have to do it in a way that a reader can follow. Mm-hmm. Right? I'm writing this book for people who read as many books as I do. I have to learn how to preserve my literary ability, but also write it in a way where it feels like air to the person reading it, right? It took her 17 years to get to that point, right? So what I'm saying is, it's, what I appreciate is a writer who's honest about where they are in their career. And they're able to go, okay, I know. So once again, I showed you my highest advance was 465. That was for a book about a football player. And my lowest advance is 35, right? And this does not show that I value one writer more than the other. It's about markets. It's about, I want the $35,000 writer to have a longer career. That $465K has to be made back in a shorter time frame. So it's like, that's an investment short term. Long term, ironically, is less money, because when she earns out this 35, her next sales numbers are going to become her next threshold. She can't get paid below X. Now, what happens if I pay the 465 to the 35K? That woman never gets 465 again. And if I try to give 35K to the football, I don't even get the book. This is like, guy, come on, like that. I make this much money in training camp. What are you doing? Right? So we're talking about understanding that the insulated meritocracy we've created for literature, where it's like, oh, everything functions different in literature. This world, this industry we're in operates like the rest of the world too. And being honest about that, it's the same way conversation like, well, you know, we don't have those diversity issues in publishing. We're fine. It's like, no, if this entire globe suffers from colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism, you think somehow the publishing industry is just this exempt space where none of these things exist. It exists here like everywhere else. And so the type of writers I'm always looking to work with are writers who are able to honestly assess and able to really do like that sort of look at the mirror and like critical self-analysis of what kind of writer am I? What kind of writer do I want to be? Where does this book fit into this trajectory? So like you look at a publisher like Beacon Press, right? Beacon Press has been around since the 1800s. They have a standard $10,000 book deal. Sometimes they go over, but they rarely do, right? Now, because the Beacon Press pays $10,000 for an advance, they already know we're not competing with the type of people who can give you hundreds of thousands of dollars, but we don't have to. We're really focused on people who are doing something really unique at a level, right? And then what I'll see is arrogant writers who go, I'm not taking $10,000 for this book. And I'm like, what kind of book is it? Well, it's a hybrid between several different genres. And actually, if you look in the book, you have to read it backwards. And I'm like, and you think you're going to get how much for that? Well, I want 250,000. And it's like, where did you get that number from? And then they'll go, well, this book won the National Book Award. And it's like, yeah, but that has no bearing on the amount of books it sold. It has no bearing on the advance. So where are you getting your numbers from? Right. And so that sort of critical assessment is what I'm looking for, is how curious are writers to understand the business. Sarah, great question. And I will say yes. Yes, there are so many writers who I've talked to, and I've had the same honest conversation. Now, as an editor, I don't have to have none of these conversations with anybody. The less you know, honestly, the better for me, because that means you don't ask questions. We just put your book out. If it does well, cool. If it doesn't, whatever. It's another book. We're on a hamster wheel anyway. So like when I get off my hamster wheel to have this conversation and someone goes, nah, I want more money. It's like, I respect that you want more money. What I tell them is accept what comes with that. Because more money comes with an expectation to sell more books. And so I'm looking at the people and I'm like, you got 900 followers on Twitter, you got 800 followers on Instagram, and you want money that suggests you have to sell more copies. I hope you learn how to get good at TikTok sooner or later. Because it's like, you ain't about to sell the amount of copies that advance is asking you to sell with your audience, right? So like, some people look at the Don DeLillos of the world, the Jonathan Franzens, and like the Ann Patchett's and the Louise Erdrichs, and they're like, oh, well, Louise Erdrich doesn't need social media. I'm like, Louise Erdrich built her bones in an industry before any of this existed. So she's a household name now. So people are looking for her books. No one's checking for a book from a debut author, right? So you have to come in with a different framework, which is not about devaluing yourself. It's about assessing your value, right? So it's like, okay, one of the best questions any writer can ask, and this is important for you to write down, anytime you hear in advance, you talk to a writer who has a deal, ask them, how many books were you expected to sell? What you will be surprised by is how many writers don't even know that answer because they're not curious. They don't even ask. They only ask once the book is already out. How many books have I sold? Oh, you sold 2,000. Is that good or bad? Now you care. It's like, it's almost too late. It's about caring before you go in. And that's what this conversation is about. It's almost like altering the course of history with a conversation like this one, because it gets you to think differently about your book. And it's like, okay, if I'm doing something hybrid and experimental, I might just take whatever editor understands this book and can publish it the best way. And there are so many writers who are even established writers. I have friends who are, Pulitzer Prize winning authors who realized that they took the money when they should have took the editor who was aligned on vision, because they took the money and not only did they get a book that they're not proud of, but they now didn't sell the copies they needed to be able to get another book deal for the same level. So now their next book, they got to take less anyway. So for all that, and this is what the writers tell me, I should have went with the person who gave me less money, because at least I would have had the book I wanted in the world. Right? So those are the sort of things that are important. And I understand for people who see their book deal as that sort of life raft that's going to financially hold them over. And I'm here to tell you, that is not a life raft. And that's why in this industry, we say, you want to be a debut writer at 60? Come on over, right? Basketball is unforgiving. Being a pop star is unforgiving. You can act at that age, but there are so many industries. One of the beauties of this industry is so many industries are so cruel to people as they get older. This is one of the industries where you can be a rock star at 56, at 77, right? So, this idea that you have to kind of, get this book out as soon as possible, it's not a sustainable practice that's going to allow you to really do your best work. Brendan asked the question, is there an actual correlation between social media presence and sales? A correlation, yeah. But not a causational relationship, if that makes sense. Like X amount of followers don't mean X amount of sales. Correlation means the more followers you have, the more books you sell. But even remember when I come back to that diagram I told you to draw, even if like 14,000, I got 14,000 followers on my account, right? I know that when it doesn't cost anything to follow me. $30 for a hardcover book. A lot of people ain't following me to the bookstore. They're like, well, I'm gonna just like this picture of your book and I'm gonna tell you I am proud of you. I'm not about to spend $30. Right?
It's also a lot faster to read a tweet than it is to read a book.
Exactly. And it's not even, once again, that's what the thing I want to shift in the language. It's not about reading the book. It's about buying the book. There is no metric we have in the world that tells you how many people have read your book. There's no metric for that. There's no way to gauge that. The metric comes down to how many people bought it. Because whether you read it or not is largely, once again, I said, it can take somebody as long as 10 years to finish one book. So there's no economic model like, oh, people reading this book in 2 years, there's no valuation for that. So the reason why I shift the language from who's going to read this, and that's even the mistake that people in publishing make is, oh, no one will read this. No, there's probably a lot of people who will read this. The question really is, how many people are going to buy this for $30? Because once you have that conversation, it changes from a conversation of aesthetics and taste to commerce. Like, okay, like I might know somebody, you take something, how many people have someone who loves to read their work? Raise your hand. If you have somebody who like you, they love your work, they read it. I will challenge you to tell them that to read the work they love from you, they have to pay $30 for it now. See how many sales you get with that same person. It immediately changes when money's on the table, right? You see a kid singing in the park, it is cute. If you had to pay $100 to see them, you might decide that kid don't sing well enough. It changes. When money's on the table, things change. And that's really the important part of this, is the book proposal is the first moment when you as a writer have to begin to think about value outside of the aesthetic of your art. And that's why so many writers are intimidated by the proposal, because now you have to have a conversation that you never had before. It's almost like being in a relationship with somebody you love deeply and y'all never talked about money. And now you got to have that conversation. And it's like, oh shit, I don't know how to, it's intimidating. You're scared. The stakes are high. You like, well, what happens if we're not aligned? Do I break up with this person? You don't know, but that's why it's important that we have these conversations sooner than later. And I realize that there's no framework currently that exists that even enables writers to even get these conversations. And so that's why I'm having it now with you. So isn't the proposal the agent's responsibility? Amarantha, what do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, I know that you're one of the very few editors that allows writers, right, to submit to
Yeah,
you directly. But a lot
right.
of editors out there, they require an agent.
Yeah.
So the proposal and the marketing, isn't that the agent's responsibility? Like that's
No,
their, aside from
think,
negotiations, or is that
no,
the authors?
it's still yours. Because think about, do you represent the agent or does the agent represent you?
The agent represents the writer.
Right. So the agent is only as good as the writer's vision. If you don't know exactly what you want to do, an agent can only do but so much. And this comes back to what I've been saying is like an agent's responsibility is to help you shape the vision, but an agent is not telling you what the vision is. And so again, what happens is you have writers who think everyone's job to make this book successful is everyone else's, but the writer's. The writer believes, I just have to write the book. You do everything else. I'm just going to go in my room and I'm going to type these words and I'm going to send it to y'all. And it's like, that is not the way it works. It's not the way it works. And more so and more importantly than that, it's thinking about who benefits from that kind of relationship. That is the kind of relationship, which is the reason why publishing for a long time was able to treat writers like shit. Because there was a time where the writer just wrote it and the publisher did everything else. But then when writers began to get curious about things more than writing, the publisher was like, we don't have to tell you this. We don't have to, we can just dispose of you and get another writer. And what has happened, going to that book, Merchants of Culture, when you read it, what has happened has become, in the arc of publishing, something that has become more equitable because the agents began to get more educated about the business of publishing. Before, the agents were more or less scouts for publishers. The agents used to work for publishers. It wasn't until the 50s and 60s to where agents started representing the true interests of writers. So what seems like common sense now is only 60 years old. So the next level of education has to happen at the writer level, because now what you have currently is agents who are more savvy than the writer, and the agent is doing all these backdoor deals that the writer is not aware of. And the writer is saying, well, you're the agent, you know, so I'm gonna listen to what you say. Now your career is hanging in the balance and you look for your agent and they've either quit or they got a promotion or they went to another agency and you're all alone. The reason why I'm educating the writer is because this is where it starts from. The writer is, like when you look at a book, there is, ironically, although publishing is a industry, publishing is something you do in community and writing is something you do in solitude. There is only one name on this book. My name ain't on the book. Your agent's name ain't on the book. So when your book doesn't come out the way you want to, people ain't gonna be like, man, who was your editor? A writer might ask you that, but the larger public doesn't even know that's the question to ask. They're gonna be like, oh, Amarantha's last book was trash. And you're like, no, I had, I had 4 different editors at that time.
The proposal, I think I just meant more marketing, not so much the proposal.
Somebody's coming through. I don't know who's talking.
She was saying, that was Amarantha again, and she was saying that she's rephrasing the question a bit. At least Amarantha, you were breaking up, so if I can rephrase to ask, saying more about the marketing side of things. She was suggesting that maybe the marketing was the agent's role. Was, I think, what Amarantha was.
The book is acquired based on the clarity of the vision from inception. A book doesn't even really get acquired no, that's not true, because some editors will acquire a book when there's no vision. So you also have editors who are really, what is that word? You have editors who are really passionate about projects and they can acquire the book, but then they've acquired a book that the sales team can't sell, the marketing team doesn't know how to market, and the publicity team doesn't know how to publicize. And when you look at those type of editors, they end up getting fired. But guess what? Your book is still with that house. So again, it comes back. This thing I'm trying to impart on you is like disillusioning this notion that like of what the responsibility a writer has. And it's about helping you recognize that you have to know more about your book than anybody. Like there's stories where writers will talk about getting rejected 256 times. And before I would hear that and I'm like, Jesus, that's crazy. And now I get some submissions and I go, oh, I get it. Like this writer did no research about who they submitted to. They didn't even look at the type of books I acquired. They didn't look at the type of agents that represent the type of work they do. They just sent their stuff out on a copy all email versus writers who like knew exactly who they wanted. Like the first book I acquired was a short story collection about the Nation of Islam, right? This woman did not have an agent. I told her, tell whatever agent you want to represent you that I'm going to buy this book. I didn't tell her who to talk to. 2 days later, she comes back with Eric Simonoff. I did not know who Eric Simonoff was, so I Googled this man, found out he's Phil Klass editor. He's the editor for the right. He's Phil Klass agent, Edward P. Jones's agent, Jesse's agent. He's an agent for the New Yorker. I was like, how are you a literary agent for a whole magazine publication? And I asked her, how did you find him? She said, oh, I Googled Edward P. Jones's agent. And I'm like, this woman already knows who she is. Like she knows who she understands herself to be as a writer. Those are the sort of writers I'm looking for. All she did was type in, I know Edward P. Jones, and I want that type of career. And she got that answer. And that man said yes to her. And he only takes on like a new person every 5 years. Yeah. Right. So this is, she's not even, it's not like he had to say yes. And he doesn't need to say yes to her, even if I am going to buy a book. So her ability to know what type of writer she is, or at least what type of writer she wants to be, got her the results she wanted. And that's all I'm saying for you to do is think really about your career and your trajectory. Like, where do I fit into this industry? Versus thinking the industry is going to fit around you. And that's the current framework that writers are graduating from these MFA programs and at large with is like, well, isn't the publisher's job to like, what is it? Court me? And it's like, you're not the one cutting the check. Like, that's not the way this works. You have to know what editors you want to be with. And that's why, like, shameless plug for this class, anybody who took this editing class, one of the assignments everyone had to do is they had to go look at their favorite book and look at the editors, because a publishing house is built on the backs of the editors who are there. So you think you want to get published by One World, and what you're really saying is you want to get published by Chris Jackson. But what if you go to One World and Chris Jackson ain't there? Guess what? You ain't get the book you thought you wanted. So understanding the interior framework and the sort of the under the hood mechanics of this industry is how you're going to succeed in it long term.
I just want to make a plug for Yahdon's class. It's called The Mechanics of Editing. Do not leave this program without taking that class, because it's more of this. And you have them for half the semester. I'm getting lots of notes from people who really love it. Yahdon, thank you so much. We're almost a half hour over, so I'm going to let you go. This has been amazing to have the privilege of a senior editor at one of the major publishing houses in the world be so open and frank. And I encourage everyone to follow his Twitter feed.
And what I'm doing right now before everyone leaves is I'm uploading the what is it called? I'm going to upload the
proposal.
The proposal outline in here.
And we'll send that around to folks too, Yahdon.
Yeah. All right. Well, you know what? Because it's saying I got to go through all these other things.
Well,
I'm gonna email.
Send it to Stuart and me, and we have a log of everyone here. But we'll send it to all the students in the MFA program. This is amazing. Okay. And we will invite you back if you'll come to do this again at another semester. So thank you so much. Thank you
all for your patience and going 30 minutes over. I appreciate your time.
Oh, we are so lucky to have you, and we appreciate you. Thank you so much. This has been phenomenal.
All right, thank you.
Bye everybody.